Welcome to the Women's Room Legal Division podcast. Today, I'm really delighted to be joined by Susan Cooper. Susan is the founder and chief executive of Accutrainee, which is a company which provides flexible legal resources to many different companies. But really interestingly, was the first company in the UK that the SRA, the Solicitors Regulatory Authority, authorised as a recognised training establishment without offering any legal services themselves, i.e. without being a law firm, which meant that instead of the usual training contract route, which people were generally following who wanted to qualify as a solicitor, they were able to come to Accutrainee, get experience working at a variety of companies, and receive sufficient training and support provided by Accutrainee to actually qualify as a solicitor. So really a forerunner of the system that's more recently been introduced by the SRA in terms of more flexible qualifying work experience, as opposed to a training contract being the only way into qualification. So I really wanted to talk to Susan today about Accutrainee and what it does, but also because she's an amazing female entrepreneur who started life as a lawyer and has really helped to open up access to the world of lawyering. So we're going to hear a little bit about Susan's journey today. Susan, welcome.
Thank you very much, Erica. Really lovely to be here. Thank you.
So I am going to start at the beginning rather than launching into Accutrainee. It would be great to hear a little bit about, why did you get into law? What happened in your early legal career? And then let's move on to the decision to set up Accutrainee and what happened along the way to get there. So let's start with, why did you decide to become a lawyer in the first place, and what sort of law did you do?
So I guess the first thing that piqued my interest in law was, rather embarrassingly, I wasn't really sure what I wanted to do. And I came across an advert in the Times, I think it was, and it was for a partner at the time. And this was obviously several decades ago, an advert for a partner position. And I sort of saw the salary and I went, well, that would probably be okay. That would sustain me, right? So that's kind of got me thinking about it, looking into it. And the more I sort of explored it, the more I recognized that it seemed that with law, you could sort of go off and do lots of different things. You wouldn't have to be sort of tied down to any particular industry or practice area. And that really interested me. I was very fond of the sciences at school. And so trying to identify a way that I could use that science background and get into law sort of again solidified a route for me that I started to find really exciting. I wanted to use my studies in genetics to go into eventually a pharmaceutical company and be a general counsel. I had it all mapped out as I went through.
Did you? Can I just ask, was there anyone in your life who was a lawyer that gave you the insight, the sort of knowledge to have that clearer plan, to know that's really what you wanted to do? Did you have lawyers sort of around?
No, it's a great question. I didn't. My father, being a professional, though, his work he knew a solicitor and put me in touch with Catherine Scholes. I remember her name. She was amazing. And I had a chat with her in my teens. Mm-hmm. And she was the one that said to me, well, you don't need to do law at university if you want to be a lawyer. And I was like, oh, really? Okay, fantastic. I can kind of carry on doing the biology and genetics I really enjoyed. And so the more then I looked into it, and I really kind of got guidance and advice from her. And then it was much more around talking to the law firms that had, an IP department, were very big in sort of pharmaceuticals, things like that. And so as I sort of went through that process, with that in my mind, the whole training contract applications, everything was always about, look, done a science degree, I'm doing a science degree, this is what I want to do. Founded the IP partners at the time and eventually managed to get a training contract at Hogan Lovells, which was Lovells or Lovell-White Durant at that time. It's changed so many times. And although I had this sort of plan really well mapped out, I did my first seat in insurance, which is, as with most first seaters, you kind of do what you're told to do. The second seat was lined up for me to go into the IP department. And I thought at that point, right, I've arrived. This is it. Fantastic. This is what I've been waiting for. And I think the sort of litigation part of it, unfortunately, I just found very slow and long-winded and just didn't really match my personality in terms of, I recognise at that point, well, actually, I really love the sort of transactions, the quick turnaround, the, let's get it done, the all-nighters, that was kind of what I, I guess got a bit of a kick out of. So at the end of my second seat, I was a little bit at a loss, having had this sort of plan in place. I thought, well, now what do I do? And I was fortunate enough to be sent to New York for my third seat, where they did sort of commercial and IP, so a little bit more of a broader experience. And in my fourth seat, I think the graduate recruitment team by then had given up on me and thought, God, what does she want to do? And they sort of threw me into banking. And probably within the first 4 to 6 weeks of that seat, I thought, this is it. I've arrived. This is what I love. Was fortunate then to be offered an NQ position in the banking acquisition finance department at Levels, and really loved it. Just great team, great firm, great work. I just was having a whale of a time. And then things changed a little bit.
Because it is funny, isn't it? Like how we have these plans, and then I guess that is one of the things, have a plan, definitely have a goal, but be willing to be flexible. I know I wanted to be a litigator, and I think my first seat was in litigation, and I just read lots of documents, but I had no clue why I was reading them for a long, long time. I did then get to go to the Falkland Islands, which was pretty amazing, on a libel action. But in the end, I loved the banking like you and capital markets. So it's interesting how, and when I was a trainee, when I was being shown round by a trainee, he said, I'm in the capital markets division. And I said, what's that? And he said, I don't really know yet. So it's funny how we go in with this plan and actually then something completely different happens. So sorry, I interrupted you. Carry on.
And actually, obviously, as you sort of mentioned at the outset, we work with trainees now. And one of the things I say to them is, like, just be patient, go and explore it, go and experience it. You will find that it may be very different in practice to what you're expecting. But no, as I was sort of saying, I was really enjoying my career, but always knew I wanted a family. And when my first son came along, again, very fortunate that Levels at the time were being very flexible, and they allowed me to kind of come back. I'd be careful with my language, allowed me, we agreed that I was going to come back on a part-time basis after my paternity leave, which again, at the time was really unusual because I wasn't a partner, I was a junior associate, and it wasn't really something that junior associates did at the time. And in particular, given the practice area I'd chosen, I think that made life a lot harder. When deals are sort of completing within a couple of weeks, when you're taking a day off a week, you miss quite a lot. And other factors made it even more challenging because we didn't have cloud computing at the time. So, the day I was not there and having to catch up all the time, and that didn't always work. And it's the same story as I think every new mother experiences when they go back to work on a part-time basis, trying to actually make sure it is part-time, even though you're sort of accepting the pay cut and all that sort of stuff. So that was challenging, but it just sort of got harder and harder, I think, for me personally, from a career perspective, in terms of what I felt I could achieve in my career and how I could grow when I had all my peers sort of racing on ahead because they weren't working part-time or because they didn't have other responsibilities. And these were all my choices. I didn't regret it at all, but I could recognize that was going to sort of eventually rub me up the wrong way a little bit. So I made the really difficult decision of leaving Levels, largely because of the children, I guess. My second one was kind of, I think, was on his way at that point. So that was a really hard decision. And it took me probably psychologically a couple of years to get over. I certainly had long period of time when I'd wake up in the middle of the night going, what the hell have I done? Why have I made my dream job? You're mad, but it just felt to me that at that time I didn't feel like I had an alternative. I didn't feel like I had an option. So that's kind of that took me out of the legal profession for a period of time. After that, actually the plan for me on a sort of career perspective, or I'm not sure if you can call it career, but a job perspective, was to set up a construction business or a property development business with my husband as an architect. The idea was that he would design houses and flats and I would be responsible for building them, which was a massive learning curve at the time.
Yeah, but how did you even come up with that? Oh, I could go. I've been a lawyer. I could go and build some properties and keep it all on, the project on time and manage all the people who are doing all the different. How on earth did you come up with that?
Well, I guess, I think with the support, it was very much a partnership with my husband. I wouldn't, if he wasn't there, having been a long time sort of property developer, I don't think I would have had the guts to do it. But, he had his own job as well. And so in a way, I was very much responsible for project managing the sites. And it was, it's funny, it's a good question, actually. I think we just kind of thought, well, yeah, that sounds like a good idea. Let's give it a go. Mm-hmm. And it wasn't a sort of Sarah Beanie type thing where they were sort of renovating lots of properties. These were all sort of new builds, so sort of building from the ground up. And that was a big culture shock for me. As I said, it was a massive learning experience. I didn't really know how to look at plans at the time. I was, at one point, I think I was trying to explain to the brickies what to do, and I realized I had the plans upside down, which was slightly embarrassing. so it was a massive learning experience. And the big plus from that, which I didn't get from my legal career, was having something very tangible at the end of it to show for my efforts. Because as we know, with the transactions and the deals that come and go, you're there for a period of time and then you step back and then, the deals happen without you, as it were. Whereas now sort of driving down the road and seeing the houses and the flats that we built, it is actually really very rewarding experience. To kind of go, okay, we did that. That was great. And then sort of fast forward that business for us, it wasn't fulfilling me, I think, from an intellectual perspective, because it was very lonely as well. I was very much, the site manager running the sites, responsible for, the materials, getting the trade guys in, the project managing it essentially. But I was very much standalone on that. Mm-hmm. And then as we headed forward several years, we started to sort of get whispers of the problems that were going on over in the States. And this was just before the financial crash of 2007, 2008. So 2007, we were starting to get a little bit nervous. So we sort of pulled back a little bit from the market. And then 2008, obviously, the crash really took hold, at which point we said, right, we're putting this all on pause. And it left me at another sort of junction in my life where I thought, well, okay, now what? At this point, I think I was pregnant with my third child then. And I remember some really good friends of mine, they sort of bought me these career books, almost like when you're at uni, like these are the different things you could do. And I thought, oh my God, how can I be here and like be thinking about what is it I want to do? So I eventually decided to do an MBA just to kind of give me a bit of time to work that through. And also because something I didn't touch on, I think even right at the outset in my school days, I always knew I wanted to have my own business. I wanted to build my own business, which kind of the property development business sort of did that to some extent, but in an area I really knew nothing about at the time. Yeah. So I knew I wanted to do my own thing, and very pointedly selected a dissertation on my MBA that sort of introduced me back into the legal profession, because I knew that was something I really missed. And so from looking at, well, at the time, knowledge management within law firms, and then looking at, what was going on in the profession with the Legal Services Act, kicking off deregulation in the profession, the alternative legal service providers, and the ability to have external investments into law firms. All of those things kind of made me feel like there were going to be lots of different business opportunities there that I wanted to explore. Mm-hmm. And as I started to explore legal process outsourcing at the time, which was taking a lot of commoditized legal work and offshoring it essentially.
So just stop, just in case people...
Sorry, am I rambling on?
Yeah, no, you're not rambling at all. I'm just thinking legal process outsourcing is sort of a term that people steeped in the world of particularly private practice sort of know about or in-house. Tell us what that is. What is that?
So with legal process outsourcing at the time, I think with the pressures going on in the legal profession, every service provider was looking to improve efficiency, reduce costs for their clients. And so looking at the chunks of work that we do, there are lots of highly commoditized, repetitive, routine tasks that we do in any particular matter. And actually looking at what's required to complete those tasks, you can then say, well, do we need a solicitor to do this? And particularly a solicitor in the UK, that's quite an expensive way of doing things. And so a lot of the large law firms at the time were talking to looking at setting up outsourcing provisions or centres in low-cost jurisdictions like India, like the Philippines and things like that. So when I started to kind of, I think, look at that a lot more, because to me, I felt that was going to be something that we'd just see more and more of. That's when I almost accidentally fell into, well, I guess the directions were slightly pivoted when I started looking at what happens with the work that junior lawyers do here then. If that does explode, if legal process outsourcing explodes in the way that everyone at the time thought it was going to, what do the junior people that are looking to train and develop and to learn how to be a solicitor, what do they do? What do they cut their teeth on? And that was sort of mirrored by a lot of the, not so much the articles themselves that I was reading, but the comments that were coming through online from students who were trying to get into the legal profession. And I guess that raised a little bit of an alarm bell in my mind when I thought, well, okay, we've always had thousands of people trying to get into the legal profession. We've now got all these students who, with university fees, have incurred debts, and they're trying to find a training contract. This problem's going to get even worse. And so the more I then started to look at the traditional training contract model and how it worked, the more there were all these issues and inefficiencies and inflexibilities that were coming out of it for me, not just from a student's perspective, but actually from the law firms and the very few in-house legal teams that gave training contracts at that time. So then I kind of explored a little bit about, well, how do we improve on that? How do we make it better?
This was all part of your dissertation, was it, at this point?
This was beyond my dissertation.
Beyond, okay.
I think this was sort of, once I'd completed the dissertation, I sort of was really exploring different ideas, and there were several things that I was kind of playing around with, but it was only when I got to this, that was the bit that for me really resonated. And I thought, no, there really is a problem here and it needs to be solved. And the more I spoke to people in the legal profession, the more I felt that there were aspects of the traditional training contract that weren't being done very well, whether that was in terms of how you identified the people, that were going to come in and do a training contract with you, in terms of how those individuals were being developed and how it was being assessed in terms of what work they were doing and what skills they were acquiring, to talking to the law firms and the in-house legal teams, where there was this inflexibility that you want a trainee, you have to have them for 2 years, there's no other option. Firms tend to sort of have these cycles of 6-month rotations for secondments for seats, which again can work in some instances, but actually works against some candidates who may be candidates is my terminology, maybe some trainees who really know what it is, having done maybe their second seat, and really feel like that's an area that they're passionate about and interested in, giving them an opportunity to explore that even further within their training contract. And it was really just identifying all of those different aspects of the training contract that wasn't marrying up with what the profession, our clients, the regulators were all saying we needed to be doing at that time. And that was, we needed to be more proactive as solicitors. We need to be problem solving not in terms of our day-to-day jobs in the deals, but actually how we operate as a profession. We need to be more innovative. We need to be more flexible, cost saving, all of those things. I was looking at the traditional training contract going, so the answer is no to all of those things. So I really wanted to revolutionize that in a way, in terms of how people qualify, but really crucially to also open up opportunities that otherwise wouldn't have existed. And really the main driver behind that was seeing the huge numbers of excellent candidates constantly slipping through the net every year. And that could be for any number of reasons, but often it was because of the opportunities that those individuals had up until that point, which maybe, or lack thereof, which wasn't allowing them to kind of get their foot in the door of organizations. And so there's a sort of two-pronged attack. How do we actually assess how those individuals are selected in the first place to ensure that we're always getting people that, we feel very strongly are going to be the best candidates, have got great potential, really driven. But also, there aren't enough places already in the backdrop of legal process outsourcing coming in and potentially lowering those opportunities or reducing those opportunities. how do we increase those opportunities? And I think our response to the second part was very much about focusing on the in-house legal teams, who until then really didn't feel that taking on a trainee solicitor was something they could or should do.
Yeah.
One, because, they can't necessarily commit to 2 years. They might not have a training program in place. They may not have the resources internally. And I think psychologically as a profession, we all were kind of grown up with, apart from 1 or 2 in-house legal teams that were huge. We did a training contract to a law firm and that was it. And then you might
move, yeah,
later on. So yes, so then the sort of idea behind Accutrainee started to formulate and develop. And I mentioned, I'd looked at lots of different ideas, and it was when I hit upon this idea and got the feedback that I was hoping to get from different providers in the profession that I thought, yeah, this is it. And I think if you're going to start a business, one of the key things that I've learned is that unless you are 200% sure about it, you may as well not bother, which sounds awful, but any business takes so much out of you that unless you are totally sure and are willing to put aside anyone that says, no, it's never going to work, this is crazy, unless you're able to kind of push beyond that, I think some of those lows, as it were, in the sort of highs and lows that you get in the entrepreneurial journey, some of those lows are going to be very hard to get yourself out of. So for me, when I kind of hit upon this idea, the more I researched it, the more I explored it, the more I thought, yeah, this is something that has to be done. And that's kind of how Accutrainee was born.
So just going back to that, you have to be sure, because what I want to be sort of really clear, because what you're not saying is you have to have 100 or 200% guarantee that it's going to be a success and you're going to make money, because obviously no one can ever be sure of that because things might change, but it's more like, I guess it's more like you have to have a passion and a drive to believe that you've hit upon a really, really good idea that's going to push you through, rather than knowing for sure it's going to make you loads of money.
Absolutely. And look, it's not about knowing for sure it's going to make you lots of money, but I think you have to know for sure that you feel very passionate about the idea, because there are millions of amazing ideas out there that for one reason or another may not have been successful, not because they weren't a great idea, but because of actually how they were put into practice. But I think as an entrepreneur, particularly if you're introducing something new, if you are going to get dissuaded or discouraged the first time someone says, oh, well, do you think that's going to work though? And what about this? You're not going to get it to the next step, because you will always come across people who don't see your passion or don't see the potential that you see. And I think you need to be, have that conviction within you to go, that's fine. You might be right. I don't know. That's up to you. But actually, I believe this is the right thing to do. And I feel really strongly that this is the right thing to do, because there will really be times when you're tested and you're challenged on that. I mean, I often say to my husband that, building Accutrainee and running it occasionally feels like death by 1,000 paper cuts, that you get a lot of knockbacks. And in particular, I think for me, in terms of my experience of the journey, introducing a new concept, a new business model to a very traditional profession, the conversations I had around, well, this won't work, or this is, we don't do it like this. This isn't how we've always done it. And I think if at that point you're going to get a bit like, oh, well, okay, yeah, maybe this isn't going to work, you might have quite a short journey, because you won't get those pushbacks without a doubt.
Yeah. And can I just ask you about imposter syndrome? Because it's really interesting listening to you. I mean, just even the fact that you went onto a building site and started telling bricklayers how to do things, what they needed to do, I find pretty remarkable. I would definitely have felt out of my comfort zone. And then you said, look, I thought there was a way to revolutionize the legal, the access to the legal services. It's pretty, so there's a lot of innate confidence there. But have you ever felt any form of imposter syndrome or self-doubt? Or have you always been someone who's just been able to just do things and not worry about them too much?
Definitely the former. Definitely. I think it's that as imposter syndrome has become more talked about and more recognized, Looking back, I think I always had it, but perhaps didn't recognize what it was.
Mm-hmm.
I felt that, particularly even in my early career days, absolutely, I was like, oh my God, what am I doing here? I don't know what I'm doing. And of course there was that. But maybe some of those challenges and having to get through them and then finding that I'm still alive at the end of it helped me recognize that, when I was stood on that building site that, yeah, okay, I don't know what I'm doing. And I think actually my professional training helped with this, because I always knew at the back of my mind, okay, I can find out though. And obviously with the house building, yeah, my husband was on the end of the phone all the time. Otherwise, if it was just me, I would have been far more nervous. So I had a lot of support through that process. With Accutrainee, I think where it was more, the imposter syndrome came up more, is that building a team myself and managing a team, that was very new to me. I'd only been a junior associate. And then, as I said, when I was building houses, I was, really just working with myself and then the different tradespeople. That was a very new experience. And I had to learn that. And I had to kind of, dare I say it, I hope none of the head office team are listening, but yeah, I had to blag my way through that in the earlier days. And I see, I'm a very, very strong believer that we're all learning every day, no matter how old we are. And that's part of the excitement and the thrill of it, that, we are hopefully improving and developing and learning something new. And so, yes, definitely the former, I would say, if there was imposter syndrome at each of those stages, and still is to some extent.
Yeah, and maybe it's not, because I think we always see it as a bad thing, but it is a sign that you're going out of your comfort zone. It's just not letting it sort of cripple you. If it hurts, it's like going to the gym. If it hurts, you're growing. You're getting stronger, but you don't want it to hurt all the time. No. So then, at the very first step of Accutrainee, what was the first contract, or what was your very first step of thinking, oh, I've done something. This might work.
Yeah, I think undoubtedly the hardest part was getting the SRA, the Solicitors Regulatory Authority, on side. And that was a really frustrating process for me, because, again, this was at the time when our regulators were saying, come on, solicitors profession, we need to be more innovative. And I was trying to do that, but really struggling to get anyone to listen to me. Mm-hmm. There were systems and processes in place. So, for example, to offer a training contract, you need to be a registered training establishment. In order to be a registered training establishment, you need an SRA number for the law firm. And trying to explain to them, look, I'm not a law firm, but I want to offer training contracts, and this is what I want to do. Took months, literally months of trying different ways to get my foot in the door, to talk to someone, to say, look, this is what we're looking to achieve here. And in fairness to the SRA, once I did that, once I was able to, and that was really through networking, that was not because of the SRA, that was because, finding the support externally to get me in front of someone where I could explain my idea, that they went, oh, well, yeah, that's a good idea. Okay. And then there were several months of explaining, how this whole model was going to work, explaining the fact that we were looking to not just offer training contracts, but offer an enhanced version of it. So going above and beyond what the regulatory requirements needed of us, but really analysing what is it that students need and trainees need. How do we ensure that they become excellent, all-round, competent, day-one, competent solicitors, and not just send them through a process, but really look at each individual, because, as with all of us being individual, we all start at a slightly different place, and we've all got different skills and strengths and different things to work on. So that was really key for me, that we wanted to offer a sort of gold standard in training contract in a way that wasn't really being done anywhere else, because, this was a known formula. We all kind of went through a training contract. We went through this 2-year period. We had a training principle. We had training records. But actually, there were some things lacking in terms of how do we know each of those individuals are actually getting exposure to all the practice skill standards, which is what the regulatory body says that we need to get exposure to. How much exposure is it? Have they genuinely learned through that experience? Have they reflected on those tasks that they've done, what they could have done to improve? And so those were all things we really wanted to bring into this process. And that, for me, not only was about having a lot of touch points with our trainees, because again, obviously they're not with us, and I haven't really explained that, I'm sorry, but so our trainees, we'll offer a training contract, but then actually, because we don't offer legal services, we send them out to different organizations in order to gain that experience that they need. Some will go to sort of 4 different organizations, some will go to one organization. It could be a mix between private practice, in-house, but every training contract was bespoke and it was unique, and it was very much designed around that particular individual, which of course was very attractive for students, and that's why we received so many applications. But in terms of when they're actually going out there, we knew we had to have those touch points, because we felt very much we were responsible for them, and we were responsible for certifying them and confirming that, yes, they've done everything that they need and they're actually at the level they need to be. But wrapped in all of that was, and again, this is about 12 years ago now, was a recognition that mentoring, coaching, that one-to-one was so important, particularly, I say particularly at the early age, but actually at any stage in your career, it's important, but certainly not something that junior people were getting much exposure to at the time. Mm-hmm. So that mentoring, I think, for us was really a key point. And as it turned out, the feedback we've always had from our trainees is that that's such an important part of the process for them, to have that individual that they can go to, that they can speak to, they can offload, they can ask questions that they might be a bit nervous about asking in their day-to-day, were all things that we felt was really adding to the whole experience of the training contract for our junior lawyers.
So you have a team of mentors that provide this service. Okay, amazing. And then how easy was it to persuade organizations? Because I presume it was reasonably easy to get applicants once you started telling universities and law schools. How easy was it to persuade firms to take your trainees effectively?
Probably the biggest challenge of the entire thing. It wasn't easy at all, and I don't know, because I haven't worked in that many different industries. I don't know how hard it would be in a different industry or different profession, but what I do know is with the legal profession, there are a lot of people that are very set in their ways, and it was very, very difficult to push the door open, particularly in the early years. And we're talking about a time when flexible resourcing itself wasn't really a thing. It was starting. We had the likes of Axiom over here, so it was definitely starting. We didn't have the sort of peer points, and that was sort of starting to come through. So not only was I sort of trying to convince people that flexible resourcing was a good idea, but actually doing it at the junior end, it was honestly, Erica, it was bonkers to start with. When we launched, the publicity and the interest in it was just at a scale that I just didn't anticipate at all.
Okay.
And we launched, and then suddenly, this was in, all the legal press and all the comments. The comments were just awful. It was so nasty. And it's like, wait, God, did I even have that?
So was that good publicity? Is it true there's no such thing as bad publicity? Was that actually bad, or was it good because people at least knew you existed?
I don't know. I think it felt pretty awful at the time. That's for sure. And and I think there was some individuals that took the time to actually read what it was we were trying to do, and then I think there was really sort of positive comments at first. But because again, this was entirely new. This was an entirely new concept. It hadn't been done before. People made an assumption that essentially what we were looking to do with trainees was to have almost like a warehouse of trainees sitting there, in an industrial kind of like just turning over work. And that was the polar opposite to what we were looking to do. We were actually looking to really make the experience very quality driven, unique to the individual. And, there were all these comments of, you can't possibly have trainees jumping in and out, of organizations. And that was never, the intention. As with every training contract, we look for secondment opportunities of ideally 6 months or more, because we want individuals to have an opportunity to go into an organization to firstly understand the way the business works, the processes, but most importantly, to have an opportunity to demonstrate to that organization why they're such a great candidate, why they're such a great lawyer. And the reason why that's important, apart from the individual's own self-confidence and self-esteem, is because we want those organizations to be offering them jobs once they qualify.
Yeah.
And I think that's probably the proudest moment or one of the proudest moments for me was, when that started to come through at the other end, because obviously, with the first few, they're starting their trading contract. But we've historically always had an excellent track record of people then, what happens to them after qualification. And currently, I think sort of over 98% of our trainees all secure one or more jobs on qualification. And we're really proud of that because it very much points to the quality of those individuals and the quality of their training. But yeah, I mean, that whole launch part, which I wasn't, that's the thing I think with media, isn't it? You kind of, it's down to what's going on in that week and that day. And if the papers don't have anything else to write about something, they'll pick up on it. And I was comforted at the time with some sort of advisors, and they said exactly the same thing as you said, like, all publicity is good publicity, but crikey, it did feel like, I needed to grow a thick skin at that point. I think, oh God, I'm honestly just trying to do something, positive. But so yes, the reason why I mentioned that is it took a long time to get people to sort of recognize, this new concept, definitely.
Yeah. And do you have, it sounds like you did have some mentors or advisors. I often talk to people about thinking about creating your own personal board of directors. So you've got some people you can call on at different stages of your life for their advice, some of whom you might not, be that close to, but they're just people, have something different to offer that you can call on. Did you have mentors and advisors around you who could help you?
Yes, is the short answer to that. I mean, I've been unbelievably lucky in the people that I have somehow managed to get around me who have been so supportive and have been a lifeline at times. And I think it's I think for your own sanity and for your own, peace of mind, it's really important that you, whether it's career or anything in life, that you do try and surround yourself by very supportive people. And that support network ranged from, from family, from my mother, my husband, to people that I didn't really know at the time. And just very, very shockingly were very open and willing to give up their time and counsel and advice. And I will be always eternally grateful to those people. And they've sort of, bless them, sort of stuck with me. Not so much the family, they've got no choice, they have to stick with me. But the advisors that I've had, the mentors that I've had, I'm not, there were times when I'm not sure I could have kept on going. So, going back to your question, it wasn't necessarily about imposter syndrome, but it was about like, gosh, you do need a lot of resilience, and you need someone occasionally that's not, I definitely have that evil, nasty voice in my head that will constantly put myself down. And so just having someone that's not me, that suddenly goes, what, you're doing okay though.
Yeah.
Keep going. And actually what you've done is, look at what you've done. And I think that was always tremendously helpful, just to have a little bit of a pat on the back, because that's a really interesting thing from an entrepreneurial perspective, because we all know that legal professionals, we're all very driven, and we're all very, we love to get a pat on the back. We love to be told we're doing a great job. It's sort of part of our psyche. And then when you suddenly become an entrepreneur and you're completely on your own, a solo entrepreneur, no one's there to do that. No one's there to give you that at all, or to kind of say, yeah, good job. You get nothing. And so when suddenly you get someone who you really respect, someone senior who, you think, wow, they're even talking to me. This is amazing. To kind of say those things, it means an awful lot, definitely.
Yeah. So my advice to everyone is think about those people that you can, create your own little personal board of directors that you can call upon. They are tremendously, useful sort of cheerleaders and support sometimes. Just one thing I was going to ask you about briefly was so I presume at some point you did need some extra cash, some money to keep the business going and to grow. And I think you mentioned you got some private equity investment. What was that like in terms of going about finding it? And then what was it like having investors? And not being in sole, complete and utter charge. I guess suddenly you've got some other people to worry about what do they think you're doing with their money.
No, that's all true. And actually, I one thing I feel that I got, I'm quite pleased with how it all worked out, was in relation to that. And as with most things in life, there was an element of a big dollop of luck that was involved. I got some private equity funding right at the beginning. So it was seed funding really more than anything else. And that was largely down to the fact that whilst I was doing my MBA, I was on a module and I was doing a pitch. At the time, again, this was legal process outsourcing. This wasn't actually the pitch that what Accutrainee became. And I did a pitch to essentially the people that were running a entrepreneurship fund for people at my MBA school. And it was very, very early days, but something I said or did sort of piqued their interest. And they said, look, just stay in touch with us and let us know how it's going. And I did do that. And in the very early days, they were great in terms of just giving me some office space to work out or just to get some headspace. And as the idea developed around the sort of new training contract model, they very much kind of stayed with me through that process. And then when the time came that I needed some funding, they were happy to invest. So my journey is very atypical. So it wasn't a situation that, particularly as a female as well, which makes sometimes things even harder, that I had to kind of go and knock on doors and, I was very, very lucky that I had this kind of already in place. And at the time I was being given advice because of the idea. And I think because people found it quite exciting. I was being told there were opportunities to kind of look elsewhere. But the one thing that I really liked about the CAS Entrepreneurship Fund, which is who eventually, I'm not even sure if they're called anymore, but who eventually invested in the business, they were very hands-off. And that's what I wanted, because I really wanted this to be my baby. And so there was a real sort of, what's the word? I think for me, I needed to know I was going to be able to do this my way.
Yeah.
And when I'd spoken to other people who'd had investments elsewhere, that just sounded like occasionally a real problem, something I had to be really careful about. But I was given a lot of assurances, and to be fair to them, they were absolutely true to that. They were there for me when I needed support, but otherwise they did very much follow my lead as opposed to saying, you should do this, that, and the other, which is great.
Yeah, amazing. Cool. So I'm going to sort of take us into sort of the closing section of the podcast. And I'm going to ask you to talk about 3 of your strengths. And this is because I'm trying to get women everywhere to start thinking about what their strengths are and to acknowledge them, because I don't think we do enough of that. And then I'll ask you about your 3 pieces of advice to your younger self. And as Susan's talking, anyone who's listening, she's talking about her strengths. Just think about your strengths. How would you answer this question? So, Susan, tell me, what are 3 of your strengths? Very proudly, tell me.
Very proudly. Gosh, all right. I think number 1, and I've learned this about myself in building up Accutrainee, has got to be resilience. And, there are things now when I look back, I would just think, gosh, I wouldn't have said I would have been able to do that, but I did, and I got through it. And so that's about getting through the lows to sort of start to enjoy the highs. And I think you need a lot of resilience on that. I don't tend to do things half-heartedly. If I don't think I can do it properly, then I'm just not going to do it. And so I do give things my absolute all. And that includes running a business versus, down to if I want to clean the kitchen, I'm like, I can't do it properly. I'm just not going to do it. We'll have to wait and I'll do it properly. So I think that's a strength. I hope that's a strength. It certainly is in certain circumstances. I can imagine that it won't be in every circumstance. Oh God, another strength. I think, well, I'm guessing I should be pretty good at multitasking, given the things that I've had to juggle over my career at times.
I just want everyone to notice Susan here. So this is something I would pick up my coach. So if Susan said in a very hesitant, questioning voice, I should be good at multitasking. So I always say, no, I'm really good at multitasking.
Yeah, I mean, there have been times where it's just, I kind of almost impress myself when I remember a detail of something that's going on with 3,000 other things, and I can go, okay, well, fine. I feel like I've got a sort of handle on it when there's lots of balls to juggle at the same time. So I think that's probably, yes, that's okay, multitasking.
And clearly a really strong entrepreneurial sort of spirit and drive, like able to think outside the box and willing to take on personal risk. Yeah, amazing. Lots of amazing strengths. And then what would your 3 pieces of advice to your younger self be looking back?
Gosh, just three, Erica. Crikey, there's so many. Well, you just touched on it, I guess, with the taking the risk. I think being more fearless when I was younger and not being scared, because and the reason why I suppose I raised that is because that's the advice I'd want to give to anybody else in my position 20 years ago. Let's say, I think that it's so easy to be fearful and fearful of failure that you end up missing out on so many opportunities in life. And so I think if I'd maybe trusted in my abilities a little bit earlier on, that would have been good. And recognizing that actually, and believe me, it took a long time to get to this point, but recognizing that actually I'm stronger and more capable than I ever thought I was. Mm-hmm. That's something I would never have said about myself even 5 years ago, let alone 20 years ago, And I think it's just about just giving myself credit where credit's due, or trying to. So that would be one thing. And maybe just being a lot more open and honest about who I am. Because I think with my sort of career trajectory, I very much sort of fell into this is what you should do. This is how you should do it. This is how people should behave. This is how others should behave. And that very much formed the narrative for me, rather than taking a step back and going, well, how do I think I should behave? And how do I think others should behave? And maybe being less influenced by this is how kind of we should, this is how it's always been done. We should do this going forward. And so that's been a real sort of an area of freedom, I guess, where I've kind of gone, no, and I don't like the expression like be your authentic self, because I feel like, I don't know, there's something about it that maybe that's what I'm getting at though, but just to be a bit more honest about not just who you are, but how you think things should be, and move forward on that basis. How many is that? Is that 3? I don't know.
Yeah.
And I think not taking things too seriously, that's probably that's been the biggest, I think, aid for positive mental health for me, in terms of just going, look, in the grand scheme of things, what's the issue here? And that even goes back to not just what's happening in my life, but also how people are behaving themselves or towards me. I used to get really disappointed and het up about how people had behaved. Mm-hmm. And just kind of going, do you know what? You do you, I'll do me. That's fine. And that's okay. And that's actually really kind of, you can feel like a bit of a weight's lifted off, where you just go, those things are not for me to worry about. I'm just going to focus on me and focus on what I need to do and my integrity and my, my kind of what's important to me. And then others will do their own thing. And I think a lot of time can be wasted in sort of analysing and stressing and fretting about those kind of things. So if I looked at 20 years ago, that would have been probably quite useful.
Amazing. Well, look, thank you so much. It's an incredible story. I particularly love the building site bit in the middle, but also you have helped to reshape the way, access to law. And I know that's one of your real drivers, is being able to open the door to people who weren't necessarily being accepted previously into training contracts, and increase the diversity of everyone coming through the profession. So it's an amazing thing that you've achieved. And just thank you so much for sharing your story with us today.
Not at all. I really appreciate it. Thanks very much, Erica. Lovely to speak to you.